The Caprock country doesn't forgive a man his mistakes. It doesn't forgive a woman hers either. The wind up there in Kestrel County comes off the escarpment in the afternoon like it has somewhere to be, and by August it carries dust in its teeth. There is a smell to that country in high summer that a man who has lived there for 60 years can identify with his eyes closed. It is a smell like scorched grass and diesel and the ghost of rain that did not come. It sits in the back of a man's throat. It waits. In August of 2003 on a Thursday, that smelled exactly that way, a young woman named Lorna Ashby walked out of the cobble feed and seed with an armload of prickly pear pads so blotched and yellowed that nobody in the county would have paid a nickel for them. She was 24 years old. She was 5 feet 6. She wore a red and cream plaid flannel that had been washed to softness, a caramel canvas jacket lined in darker brown, and jeans so faded they were the color of dry creek water. Her hair was the color of pecan shells, with sun in it, tied back low, some of it loose against her temples. She had a smudge of caliche on her cheek she hadn't noticed. She had a look on her face like she was reading small print nobody else could see. 6 men were leaning on the porch rail of the feed and seed. 3 of them were laughing. Girl, Hollis Rourke said, tipping the brim of his straw hat back with one thumb, "You fixing to feed those to something or scare something with them?" The others laughed harder. One of them slapped the porch post. Lorna kept walking. She loaded the pads into the bed of a green Chevy pickup that had been her father's since '89, and she loaded them careful like they were eggs. Then she went back inside and came out again with a burlap sack of stunted mesquite seedlings. Some of them with the nursery bags torn, most of them not much taller than a coffee cup. "Miss Ashby," Rourke called out louder now, playing to the crowd, "if you're planting a hedge, you got the wrong kind of thorns. Them things won't stop a jackrabbit." Lorna set the sack in the bed. She closed the tailgate slow. She turned and looked at Hollis Rourke, and she didn't smile, and she didn't frown. She just looked at him a moment too long for comfort. Then she got in the truck and drove north out of Cobble on the 2-lane, and the men on the porch went right on laughing because they had 460 acres of dead ground to laugh at and a girl to laugh at on top of it, and it was cheaper than beer. 6 years later, they were not laughing. 6 years later in the drought that would come to be called by its year, the way old men name the wars they lived through. Those same men stood at the fence line of the Ashby place with their hats in their hands. Their cattle were dying in the shade of nothing. Their bordering pastures were the color of old bone. And through the wire on ground they had once called worthless, they saw green. Not pasture green, not a lawn. A hard, wiry, stubborn kind of green that had learned how to hold on. Hollis Rourke, who had leaned on that porch rail and made the loudest joke, stood at the fence with his hat off. He held it against his chest. He waited. And after a while, Lorna Ashby came out of the shade of a mesquite. She had planted the same summer they laughed at her, and she walked to the fence in boots that were older than the trees. And Hollis Rourke swallowed once and said the thing he had promised himself for 6 years he would never say to a woman he had mocked in front of witnesses. But we are not there yet. We are back in the winter before the pear pads and the laughter and the drought. We are back in January of 2003 in a small bedroom off the kitchen of a farmhouse that had been standing since before Kestrel County had a paved road running through it, listening to a dying man breathe. Emmett Ashby had been coughing for a year. The doctors in Lubbock had names for it and pills for it, and by December, the pills weren't doing anything but making him drowsy. He was 61. He had worked the same 460 acres north of Cobble since he was 19. He had buried a wife's brother, raised 3 children, buried the middle one, a daughter named Willa, who had died of a burst appendix at 22. And now he was dying himself in a room that smelled of Vicks and cedar and the faint sourness of a man who cannot get out of bed. The room had one window. The window looked east toward the ridge. In the last week of his life, when he could still turn his head, he turned it that way. Lorna sat by him most nights. Her brothers didn't. Garrett was in Fort Worth selling auto parts out of a warehouse on Jacksboro Highway. Lonnie was in Amarillo driving a cab. They called on Sundays. They did not come home. There is a distance between a man and the ranch he was raised on that has nothing to do with miles. And by January of 2003, both of Emmett's sons had lived inside that distance for so long that neither of them could remember the smell of the cedar in the west windbreak. Lorna could remember it. Lorna had never left. On the last night when the cough had gone quiet, the way a train goes quiet before it stops, Emmett moved one thin hand out from under the quilt and pointed with two fingers at the floor beside the bed. "Under there," he said. His voice was paper. Lorna knelt. She reached under the box spring and dragged out a tin biscuit box painted with faded blue flowers. She set it on the quilt beside his hip. He put his hand on top of it. His hand was cold, but the tin was colder. "Later," he said, "not now." "Papa." "Later." He closed his eyes. "You'll know when." She did not open it. She sat with her hand on his hand on the tin, and she listened to him breathe, and by 4 in the morning, he wasn't breathing anymore. She sat with him another hour before she went to wake her mother. The clock on the mantel ticked in the front room. The porch light was still on. Somewhere far off, a coyote made one thin sound and stopped. The house was as quiet as a house gets, and Lorna Ashby, 24 years old, sat with her dead father's hand under hers and did not move because she had learned from watching her mother that some silences a woman is meant to keep, and this was one of them. The funeral was on a Wednesday. It was cold enough that the wind had teeth. Garrett drove in from Fort Worth in a black Dodge, still wearing the shirt he had worn to work that morning. Lonnie came up from Amarillo in a rented sedan and brought a woman none of them had met. The little church at the crossroads was half full. Emmett Ashby had not been a joiner. He had been a man who nodded at neighbors and worked past dark, and half full was more than he would have asked for. Odell Ashby, Lorna's mother, sat in the front pew with her hands folded and did not cry where anyone could see her. The preacher was a soft-spoken man from a bigger church down in Lubbock who had married Emmett and Odell 39 years earlier and who had also stood over Willa's grave in the fall of '98. He said the things a preacher is supposed to say about a man who worked hard and did not complain, and he said them well enough that a few people in the back pews cried, and Lorna sat beside her mother and did not cry because she had already done all of her crying alone. After the burial, they went back to the farmhouse. There was a pot of pinto beans on the stove and a foil pan of cornbread and a plate of pecan sandies somebody's aunt had brought, and nobody could remember whose aunt. When the last of the neighbors had shaken hands and gone, the three siblings and their mother and Newt Prentice, Willa's widower, walked out to the yard together and sat on wooden folding chairs somebody had set up under the big mesquite behind the house. The mesquite had been planted by Emmett's grandfather in 1908. It was not a beautiful tree. It was a survivor. Its bark was cracked, and its lower branches had been rubbed smooth by cattle 100 years ago. It cast a lace of shade in the winter sun, and the ground beneath it was hard-packed and clean. A stone from the old wellhead sat at the base of it. Emmett had sat on that stone in the summer of '99, the day after Willa was buried, and he had not moved for 6 hours, and Lorna, then 19, had brought him water and set it beside him and gone back into the house without a word. It was the first time she had understood that grief in a grown man could be a private country he did not invite anybody into. Garrett was the one who said it. "Mama," he said, "we've got to sell the cows." Odell didn't answer. She looked at her hands. "We've got to sell the cows before what's left of them dies," Garrett went on. "And the land too, if there's a buyer. This place hasn't paid for itself in 6 years. We've all seen the ledger." "There's $8,400 owed to the co-op," Lonnie said. He said it apologetically, the way a man reads bad news off a page he did not write. "And Merle over there told me on the phone the note's got a balloon payment on it. There's a date." "When?" Odell said. "September of next year." Lonnie looked at his cigarette instead of at his mother. 18 months, near enough. Newt Prentice cleared his throat. He was a thin man with sad, kind eyes, and he had never gotten over Willa. "The Jaeger fellow from Dallas came around in the fall," he said. "Asked me to pass along his card. Said he'd take a look if the family ever wanted to talk." "Jaeger," Garrett said. He nodded like this was the answer to a question. "That's the landman. He was up here in the summer, buys ranch parcels along the 2-lane. Lorna hadn't spoken. She was looking at the pale gray line of the far ridge. From the yard, you could just make out an old contour of stones her father had laid there in the 80s. A broken berm. He had never repaired the ghost of a fence, some prickly pear that had gone half wild after the goats got into it a decade back. She could see the shape of the land the way a woman looks at the face of someone she loves and sees a bruise. Papa didn't fail because the land was bad, she said. She said it quiet. She didn't look at her brothers. He failed because he worked it the way everyone told him to work it. Garrett laughed once, a laugh with no smile in it. Lorna, honey, this ain't about feelings. This is about numbers. It's not feelings. It's dirt, Lonnie said. It's dirt with a lien on it. Papa broke his back on this ground, Garrett said, and it never came in for him. You want to break your back too on what on stones sell the cows, Lorna. Rent the pasture. Come to Fort Worth. There's clerk work at the parts house. I'm not moving to Fort Worth. Then Amarillo, Lonnie said gentle. I'm not moving. Newt Prentice looked at his boots. Odell looked at the ridgeline where her daughter had been looking. She said, boys, let her be tonight. Garrett stood up. His folding chair scraped the couch. Mama, the note comes due whether we're feeling merciful or not. Jaeger's card is on the kitchen counter. I'm leaving it there. He looked at Lorna. He softened just a little. I don't want to hurt you. I want you not to lose everything. I know that. Then think about it. I went inside. Lonnie went with him. Newt sat a minute longer, then he touched Odell's shoulder and went too. The wind moved the mesquite branches a fraction of an inch, no more. Odell said without looking at her daughter. Your papa had a look you've got right now. It never brought him luck. I'm not looking for luck. I know. They sat there a while. Then Odell got up slow and went inside to wash the plates because that is what she had done every night for 39 years, and grief is not enough of a reason to change it. Lorna stayed under the mesquite until the sun was gone. The yard cooled fast the way a January yard cools in that country. She could hear the pump on the shared well kick on somewhere across the fence line, and she could hear the neighbor's dog bark twice and stop. And she could hear the tick of the metal barn roof as it contracted in the cold. She listened to all of it. She was cataloging. She was doing the things she had been doing since she was 9 years old, which was noticing what the ranch sounded like when nobody was making it perform. Then she went into the house and back to her father's little bedroom off the kitchen, and she pulled the tin biscuit box out from under the bed a second time. Inside the tin, there was a folded plat map from 1957 brown at the creases. There were 3 photographs. In one, a young Emmett Ashby stood beside a stock tank half full of water, and behind him, the ridge was hazy with grass. In another, 3 children posed in front of a rain gauge. Garrett tall, Willa in a pinafore, a baby Lonnie clutching Willa's hand. In the third, Emmett, as a boy of maybe 9, stood beside his own father, both of them holding shovels, both of them squinting. And there was a notebook. It was not a nice notebook. It had a green cardboard cover softened by decades of pocket carry. Its spine was held together with a strip of black electrical tape. The corners were rounded from years of going in and out of a shirt pocket. Inside, in Emmett Ashby's cramped, patient handwriting, were 31 years of rainfall dates and calving dates and prices and observations. Prices in 1972, a drought note from the summer of 79. A page of pencil-drawn dots that Lorna slowly understood was a diagram of where cactus had grown wild along the north fence in 1980 before the goats. She turned pages until she reached the summer of 1982. On a Tuesday in July of that year, her father had written in a hand that seemed careful. The way a man is careful when he writes something he half doesn't want anyone else to see. Where the pear stood thick, the ground held cool 3 days longer. Where I cleared, even the earth ran off and did not stay. Maybe the brush don't get in the way near as much as they say. She read it twice, then a third time. She sat down on the edge of her dead father's bed. She pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth. She did not cry. She had done her crying already alone in the walk-in pantry the morning after he died, standing between the shelves of home canned beans and pear preserves so nobody would hear her. She was empty of crying now. What she felt sitting on that bed was something else. It felt the way it feels when you finally understand the last thing someone said to you before they left the room. Her father had known. Her father had known, and he had not done it because to do it would have been to stand in front of the men at the feed and seed and tell them the way they had all done it for 100 years was wrong. Emmett Ashby had been many things, but he had not been a man who could bear that. He had been a proud man and a private man, and the two together are heavy freight. I had known. He had written it down, and he had left the notebook where his only remaining daughter could find it. Lorna sat in that bedroom until the moon was up over the barn. She held the notebook against her chest. She did not open it again that night. She already had what she needed. She had a father who had passed her a question, and a question is a kind of inheritance too. The next morning she drove to the co-op in Cobble and asked Merle Tanscott for the papers on the note. Merle was a stout man in his early 60s with reading glasses on a chain around his neck. He had been chairman of the grazing co-op for 11 years, and he had known Emmett since childhood. He had gone to school with him in a two-room schoolhouse whose foundation was still visible in a pasture off Farm to Market 2149. He had stood up at Emmett's wedding. He had carried a corner of Willa's coffin. He was the kind of small-town figure who was in effect the memory of a place. And when he sat Lorna down in his little office that smelled of copier toner and Folgers, and put on the glasses and read out the numbers. Slow, he was not just reading numbers. He was reading what her father's last year on earth had cost. $8,400 principal, near enough. Interest at 9.25. There's the balloon at maturity. That's the whole remaining balance due in one lump. September 1504. 20 months. That's the shape of it. And the deed. Merle looked at her over the glasses. Deeds held between the three of you. Your daddy did that 7 years ago when your mama had her stroke, so it'd move clean when the time came. Any one of the three of you can force a partition sale. You know what that means. It means either I buy them out or the land gets sold at auction. That's about the size of it. Lorna nodded. She looked at the water stain on Merle's ceiling. She did some arithmetic in her head. Between the note and buying out her brothers at even a friendly price, she was looking at a mountain she did not have a rope for. Merle, she said, if I made the payments on time and I paid the balloon when it comes due, could I buy them out slow on an installment? That'd be between you and them. I'd draw the papers if they'd sign them. And if I miss even one payment before the balloon. Merle took off the glasses. He folded them. Then Yeager or somebody like him gets a phone call. I'd rather that not be the outcome, but that would be the outcome. Yeager, she said. Delph Yeager, Fort Worth, Dallas, land agent, buys along the 2-lane. For what? Merle hesitated. He set the glasses down on the desk. Officially warehousing sites. Agricultural storage. Unofficially, he looked out the little window at the co-op parking lot for a moment. He was choosing his words. He was a man who chose his words the way another man might choose ammunition one at a time with attention to the target. Officially, I don't know a thing, Lorna. And unofficially, I don't know much more. She waited. He sighed. There's a man in Austin filed water rights applications on 3 of the parcels Yeager bought north of here last year. Applications for volumes that would draw down the Ogallala under this whole valley if they were fully exercised. That's rumor. That's the porch talk. Don't quote me. Lorna did not move. She said after a moment, Thank you, Merle. I'm sorry about your daddy. I know. She drove home the long way. She stopped the truck at the top of the rise where the 2-lane bent north, and she got out and stood in the wind. From up there, you could see the whole valley. You could see the Ashby place and the Rourke place and the Prentice place, and beyond them, the McGinnis place, and Old Man Coffee's place, and the little rented farms hooked along the section road. All of them were sitting on water. All of them were sitting on the same water. She thought about a man in a suit in Dallas who had never smelled this dirt drawing a pencil line under all of it. And she thought about her father's handwriting in a green notebook. And she thought about her brothers waiting for her answer. She said out loud to nobody, "I'm not selling." The wind carried it off. She got back in the truck. The idea had come to her by the time she got home. It was a simple idea, and it did not sound like an idea to anyone who might have heard her explain it. Her plan was not first to plant to sell. Her plan was to make the ranch stop losing water. Before anything else, before pasture, before cows, before pride, just stop the water from running off. She would repair the broken berms her father had built and let fall. She would cut swales along the contour lines of the ridges, running slantwise across the slopes, so the runoff would slow down and pool and sink. She would plant prickly pear in thick living rows where the wind hit hardest because the pear held soil under it and held moisture too, and because in a bad year, the pear could feed cattle if you knew how to prepare it. She would protect the mesquite and huisache seedlings that had been chewed down to sticks by the goats and let some of them grow. She would fence off certain patches from the herd for a full year, maybe two, and let them rest. She would work in small pieces. She would prove nothing to nobody. She would keep books. She said all of this to Newt Prentice on the porch 2 days later. Newt listened with his sad eyes and turned his coffee cup in his hands. And when she was done, he said, "Gentle, Lorna, so you're going to spend the little money you've got left to dig holes for the water to sit in. Swales. Whole swale ditch. Call it what you want to call it. They'll hold soil, Newt, and they'll feed the pear and the mesquite. And in 5 years, you'll be broke. In 5 years, the note'll be past due, and this place will be Jaeger's. That's what 5 years will get you." She looked at him. She said, "Newt, you love my sister." "You know I did." "Then trust me a little." Willa would have. He looked at his cup. He didn't answer. But he didn't argue anymore either. Willa's name was a place in a conversation that no one else in the family could go. And Lorna did not use it lightly, and Newt Prentice, whose sad, kind eyes had not lost a certain wetness, in the 5 years since Willa was buried, understood exactly what his sister-in-law was doing to him and forgave her for it, because a man who loves a dead woman is grateful to anyone who still says her name out loud. She sold 7 calves early. She got below market for them because early calves at January weight is a buyer's market, and everyone in Kestrel County knew it. She paid down the interest on the note, and she paid Merle a little something on the arrearages. What was left she took to Cauble on a Thursday, and that is where the beginning of this story starts to make sense. Because Thursday was the day she walked out of the feed and seed with 800 blotched prickly pear pads that a rancher up in Vanagas had sold her cheap because nobody wanted them for produce. 1,200 stunted mesquite and huisache seedlings from a community nursery over near Cedral that were half of them crooked and half of them too short, and all of them the kind of thing a fashionable landscape man would have burned. She bought a line level and 100-foot length of clear tubing to make a water level with. She bought picks and shovels and a steel bar. She bought baling wire and stakes and lime for marking. She spent almost every dollar she had. She loaded the truck, and Hollis Rourke and his friends leaned on the porch rail and made the jokes we already heard, and Lorna drove north on the 2-lane with her father's ghost sitting in the passenger seat. What she did not see as she pulled out of the feed and seed lot was the man in the tan sedan across the street. He was watching her over the top of a folded newspaper. He was a soft-looking man in a jacket too warm for August, and when Lorna's truck turned north, he made a small note in a leather book and slid the book into his jacket pocket. His name was Delph Jaeger, and he did not work for a warehousing outfit, but we are not there yet either. She hired Bertram Neighbors and his boy Cade 3 days later. Bert was in his 50s, a wiry man with skin like a saddle and a habit of saying yes ma'am to any woman over 16. He had worked for Emmett off and on for 20 years. He needed the work, and he was tired of driving to the highway job. His boy Cade was 17 and did not want to be there. Cade slouched. Cade rolled his eyes. Cade laughed at his father when Bert was polite to a woman. But Cade could dig a hole faster than any man in the county, and he needed money for a truck of his own. And so on a Monday in August of '03 at 6 in the morning, Bert and Cade Neighbors climbed into a battered Ford and drove out to the Ashby place. Lorna met them at the gate with the line level in her hand and a shovel over her shoulder and a smudge of caliche already on her cheek. "Miss Ashby," Bert said and touched the brim of his hat. "Morning, Bert. Morning, Cade." Cade grunted. She walked them to the ridge. It was the worst ground on the whole place. It was the ground her father had never made anything of. The topsoil was thin as newspaper up there, and the caliche came up to daylight in patches. The wild pear had been chewed to nubs. The wind moved across it in a low, continuous hiss. "We're starting here," Lorna said. Cade looked around. He looked at his father. He said, "Here, here." "Ma'am," Bert said, "careful, if I may, the bottom ground be easier, and it'd take water. The bottom takes water for an hour and then loses it. I want to catch it up here. If we catch it up here, the bottom gets it slow." Cade snorted. Bert cut him a look. Lorna set the line level on a flat stump and unrolled the tubing. She showed them how the clear water in the tube would find the same height at both ends, no matter what the ground did, because water knows things people forget. She walked 20 paces along the ridge with one end of the tube, and Bert held the other. Where the water in her end sat at the same mark as the water in his end, she drove a lime-dusted stake. She moved 20 paces further. She drove another. She was drawing a line across the face of the ridge that ran neither up nor down, but exactly level. It curved. It followed the shape of the land the way a signature follows the shape of a name. Cade watched. He said, "Miss Ashby, with respect, water don't hardly slow up here. It comes ripping down after a hard rain. It's going to jump right over your ditch. That's why the ditch doesn't run straight down. Ma'am, if the ditch runs across the face of the slope slantwise, the water can't build speed. It hits the ditch broadside. It has to sit down. It has to think about it." "Water don't think, ma'am?" "No," Lorna said, "but it can be taught to get tired." Cade laughed. It was a real laugh, not a mean one, but a laugh. "Water can be taught to get tired," he said. "That's a hell of a thing." "Everything gets tired," she said, "if you put enough stones in the way." She said it flat. She said it the way a woman says a thing she has already believed for a long time. Bert Neighbors looked at his boy, and the corner of his mouth moved. They started digging. The first swale took them 8 days. 8 days for maybe 240 feet of ditch across the face of the worst ridge on the ranch. Dug slantwise on the contour, deeper on the downhill lip, packed and shaped and reinforced on the low side with the stones they pulled out of it. By the third day, her hands were open. By the fifth, her neck was scorched. By the eighth, her mouth had cracks in the corners and her lower back had opinions. They planted 11 pair rows along the windside. They set 280 seedlings inside brush corrals made from cut mesquite branches because the goats and the deer would eat a young mesquite the moment it caught its breath. They dragged in dead brush and packed it into the deep parts of the ditches to slow the first big rain when it came, if it came. From the county road, nothing looked different. That was the part that took the wind out of her the most. She would stand on the 2-lane at dusk and look east at her own ranch and see the same broken, cracked open ground her father had failed to make anything of. No matter how hard you squinted, you could not see $1 worth of 8 days' work. It was all in the shape of the land, and the shape of the land does not photograph. The laughter got louder. At the cantina in Cobble, Newt Prentice of all people. Newt, who had listened on the porch, said with a beer in his hand that Lorna was planting thorns to harvest pity. Merle Tanscott heard about it from 3 separate men before the week was out. At the co-op meeting the following Tuesday, a rancher named Denton asked out loud if Lorna Ashby was going to put a parasol on her cows next. Hollis Rourke at the same meeting said a woman alone needed a husband, not a contour line. The room laughed. Lorna was not in the room. But in a small town, shame walks faster than rain, and by nightfall she had heard every word. She sat at the kitchen table that night with the green notebook open in front of her. She was not reading it. She was writing in one of her own. A blue spiral-bound one she had bought at the drugstore in Lubbock. On a fresh page she wrote Phase 1. Bad Berm Ridge. Objective. Make water last 1 day longer. Under that she wrote the date. She wrote the cost of the tubing and the line level. She wrote the number of pear pads planted and how many she thought would take. She wrote how many seedlings, how many brush corrals, how many hours Bert had worked, how many Cade had. She wrote what the soil under the ditch had looked like before and what it looked like after 8 days. She was making a book. She was making the same book her father had made. She just did not know yet that that was what she was doing. Her mother came out of the back room in her nightgown and her robe. Odell Ashby had aged 10 years in the 6 weeks since the burial. She sat down across from her daughter and pulled the coffee toward her. Does it hurt what they say? You've known me since before I could lie. That's not an answer, girl. Lorna set the pencil down. They say a woman alone can't lift a ranch. Odell adjusted the shawl around her shoulders. She looked at the yellow ring the ceiling light made on the table. She said the thing that was going to walk with her daughter through the next 6 years like a second heartbeat. A ranch don't get built on a mustache, she said. It gets built on whoever stays when everyone else leaves. Lorna put her hand on her mother's hand. Mama. Hush, Odell squeezed once. Drink your coffee. They sat together at the table for a long time after that mother and daughter, and neither of them said anything more. The night wind pushed a screen door somewhere at the back of the house. A dog barked twice 1/2 mile off and stopped. Odell's hand under Lorna's was as thin as a folded fan. Lorna could feel the bones of it. She thought without wanting to that this hand had held Willa's hand when Willa was 7 years old and had a fever of 104, and had held Emmett's hand 3 weeks ago in the same little bedroom off the kitchen, and would probably one day be held by Lorna's own hand in another such bedroom, and that a woman's hand was the shortest history there was of a family. She did not say any of that out loud. Odell would have thought it was fancy talk. Two things happen before part 2 of this story begins that a man of a certain age would want to know about. The first is that on a Wednesday morning in September of 2003, when Lorna went to Cobble to pick up a spool of wire, she came out of the hardware store to find a soft-looking man in a jacket too warm for the weather standing beside her father's green Chevy pickup. He was not touching it. He was standing near it. He had a leather book in his hand, and he was writing in it. Miss Ashby, the man said and smiled. He had a smile like a business card. Delph Yeager, I represent a group out of Dallas. I wonder if you have 5 minutes for me one day this week. I have a proposal I think might be of significant interest to your family. Lorna looked at him. She did not smile back. I don't have 5 minutes, she said. Not today, I understand. I'll leave a card. I don't need the card. His smile did not move. You might, though, in due time. September is a long way from next September, isn't it? Notes have a way of coming due before a woman is ready for them. Lorna felt the back of her neck get cold. This was a man who already knew the date of her balloon payment. She said, Have a good day, Mr. Yeager. She got in the truck. She drove home. Her hands did not shake until she was on the 2-lane and past the mailbox. She pulled the truck over then on the shoulder in a stand of Johnson grass gone to seed, and she put her forehead down against the steering wheel, and she took 10 long breaths, not because she was afraid, because she was calculating. There is a difference. A woman afraid runs. A woman calculating waits. Lorna Ashby, at 24 years old, sat with her forehead against the wheel of her father's truck and did the math on how much time she had and how many enemies were counting the same days. And by the time she started the engine again, she had a small, hard thing sitting in her chest that would still be there 5 years later when Delph Yeager withdrew his water applications in Austin. The second thing that happened was that on a Friday evening, 2 weeks after that, Lorna walked out to the ridge where the first swale had been dug, and she stopped. She stopped because in the failing light she saw something she had not seen before. She saw where her father had dug. She saw it because the stones her father had once laid in a broken berm, 80 yards to the east, were exactly the same stones laid at exactly the same angle as the stones she and Bert and Cade had just packed into the low side of her first ditch. She saw it because a section of the old berm, when she followed it with her eyes, ran on the contour. It ran level. It ran the way her line level had taught her water ran when you got out of its way. Her father had started this. He had started it once a long time ago in a summer when nobody was watching, and he had stopped because he had lost his nerve, or lost his time, or lost his belief that the men at the feed and seed would ever forgive a man for being right. He had left it there for her. She sat down on the packed earth beside her own new ditch. She put both hands flat against the ground. She felt the last of the day's heat in the dirt. She said out loud in a voice that was not quite steady, "All right, Papa." Just that. Nothing else. Then she stood up and walked back to the house because there was a lot of work to do and only one pair of hands to do it with. And September of '04 was not going to wait for a woman to finish crying. What she did not yet know, what she would not know for another 2 years, was that Delph Yeager already had a file on her family that was 2 inches thick, and that a man in a straw hat named Hollis Rourke, who had leaned on the feed and seed porch and laughed the loudest, had a reason to want the Ashby place empty that had nothing to do with laughter and everything to do with a fence line and a water well and a private deal he had signed the previous spring. The laughter was not just laughter. The laughter had a bill of sale behind it. And in the fall of 2003, on 460 acres of ground, that everyone in Kestrel County had already written off a 24-year-old woman with cracked hands and her dead father's notebook in her jacket pocket was about to spend the next 6 years finding out the hard way just how much of West Texas was quietly for sale and just how little a woman working alone was expected to notice. She was going to notice. She was going to notice everything. The first rain of the spring came in late April of 2004, and it came the way rain comes in Kestrel County when it has been holding back, which is to say all at once and mean about it. It began at 3 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. By 3:30, the sky over the escarpment was the color of a bruised plum. By 4, the wind had turned and the first fat drops were hitting the tin roof of the Ashby barn one at a time like coins dropped on a stove. And then it opened. Lorna Ashby was in the kitchen when it started. She was standing at the window with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand, and she watched the ridge to the east disappear behind a gray curtain, and she did not move. She did not run out to check anything. She did not put on her jacket. She stood there, and she watched, and her mother came up quiet behind her and looked out over her shoulder, and neither of them spoke for a long time. "That's a fast one, Mama," Lorna said. "Yes, it is. It's the first real one since Papa." "Yes, it is." Odell put a hand between her daughter's shoulder blades. She left it there a moment, then she went back to the stove. Lorna drank her coffee. She watched the rain. She listened to the sound of a year of work being tested by a sky that did not care one way or the other about a young woman's plans. In her mind, she was walking the ridge. She was seeing the swale she and Bert and Cade had cut across the face of it that August. She was seeing the pear rows and the brush corrals and the 11 small berms she had reinforced with fieldstone through the winter. She was seeing all of it, and she was hearing the water come down through the switchgrass and the caliche and the dead cheatgrass, and she was praying without knowing she was praying that the ditches would hold. They partly held. The rain quit at 5:15. It had dropped nearly 2 inches in a little over an hour, which anywhere else in the country would have been a nuisance rain. But on the Caprock in a dry spring on ground that had been baked hard as a plate, it was a wrecking ball. Lorna put on her jacket and her mud boots, and she walked out through a yard that steamed. The air smelled the way it only smells after the first real rain in West Texas, which is a smell like copper and wet cedar and something older than either. It was the smell she had grown up on. It was the smell that had made her father stop what he was doing and step outside every time. She walked up the 2-track to the ridge, and Bert Neighbors met her halfway. He had come over from his little house on the section road when the rain broke. He was walking slow. He was not smiling. He was not frowning either. He had the face of a man who has news that is going to require choosing. "Miss Ashby, Bert, you need to come see." They walked up together. The ridge was quiet. The wind had gone soft. The pear pads were beaded with water. The mesquite seedlings inside their brush corrals were standing up straighter than they had stood in 8 months. The ground beneath Lorna's boots was soft, not muddy, soft the way a loaf of bread is soft. She could feel her heels sink half an inch and stop. And then she saw it. Two swales up from the bottom right where the ridge broke, steepest the ditch had blown out. A 20-foot section of the low-side berm had failed. The rocks she and Cade had spent an afternoon packing in were scattered 30 feet down the slope. The dirt above the break was cut into a raw gouge as wide as a truck door. Below the break, a fan of red-brown mud spread across the pasture, and in the middle of the fan, three of the mesquite seedlings she had nursed through the winter were flat on the ground with their brush corrals ripped open. Lorna stood there and looked at it. She did not say anything for a long time. Bert took his hat off. He turned it slow in his hands. He said, "Careful, Miss Ashby. Above the break the water sat. You can see where the ditch held. But right in there where the slope turns, you had a bend and the water hit it broadside and it just—" "I see it, Bert. We can fix it." "I know we can. It ain't as bad as it looks." "I know that too." She sat down on a flat stone at the edge of the blown-out ditch. She put her elbows on her knees. She looked at the ruin of half a day's work in 3 months' hope. She closed her eyes for the count of 3. She opened them. "Bert," she said, "did you see how the water moved, ma'am? Before it broke, before the ditch failed. Did you see the way the water came down the slope?" Bert looked at her. He set his hat back on his head. He walked a few paces along the ridge and looked at the gouge and then up the slope above it, at the pattern the water had left in the caliche and the flattened grass. He walked 20 feet further and looked at another patch. He came back. "It come down that draw right there," he said and pointed. "Not straight down the face. It come from the crown of the ridge along that little natural crease. And it hit the swale right where the swale bent, and the swale wasn't deep enough on the low side at that bend, and it just poured over." "Yes, ma'am." "So the ditch wasn't wrong. The angle was wrong at that one place." "Yes, ma'am. That'd be my read." Lorna stood up. She walked to the head of the blown-out section. She followed the little natural crease Bert had pointed to up to the crown of the ridge. It was maybe 6 inches deep. It was almost invisible unless you knew what you were looking for. It was the shape water had been making in that hillside for 1,000 years before anybody named the county, and she had cut her swale straight across it as if it wasn't there. She turned and looked back down at the gouge. She said, "Quiet, Papa." Bert didn't answer because he did not know she was talking to a dead man. She was talking to a dead man, and what she was saying to him was thank you, because the swale had not simply failed. The swale had told her in the language of moved dirt and scattered stone exactly where the water on this hillside actually wanted to go. She had drawn a line across the face of the ridge with a bubble level and a length of tubing, and the ridge had answered her with a red-brown scar that read, plain as any writing in a green notebook: "This is where I run when I run. Move your ditch. Deepen your low side at the bend. Feed a spur off the head of the crease, and I will slow down for you next time." She could not have known that from a book. She could not have known it from a classroom. She could only have known it because she had cut a ditch and the ditch had blown out, and she had walked up in the rain to look at what the water had done to it. Failure is a teacher no lecture ever replaces. Failure will tell you the truth about a piece of ground faster than 100 experts. The ranch had spoken to her the way it had spoken to her father in 1982, when he had noticed that the pair held soil under it. She said to Bert, "We fix it Thursday, all along the ridge, every swale where a crease comes down. We deepen the low side at the bend. We put a shorter spur at the head of the crease to break the speed. We add a stone weir at the low end, so if it does overtop, it don't cut through." "Yes, ma'am. I know it's more work. I don't mind more work if the more work is right work." She looked at him. He was a wiry man in his 50s with skin like a saddle and a habit of saying yes, ma'am. He had worked for her father off and on for 20 years, and he had shown up in the rain because she had a problem he thought he could help with. She said, and she meant it, "Thank you, Bert." "Ma'am." They walked back down together, and the sun broke through the last edge of the clouds behind them, and the whole east face of the ridge lit up with a color she had never seen the ridge wear before. It was a deep, dark, wet color, and where the swales had held the water was standing in shallow stair-step puddles between the pair rows, and the puddles were not draining fast. The puddles were sinking. The puddles were going into the ground the way water goes into a sponge that has been dry too long, slow and grateful. She walked past a place where only a week before she had used the tip of her boot to break the crust of the soil, and it had cracked like a fired clay tile. She stopped at that same place now. She squatted down. She pressed two fingers into the ground. The ground gave. It gave for the length of her fingers. She brought her hand up and there was dark earth under her nails, and it smelled the way dirt smells in a garden, not the way dirt smells in a drought. Bert was watching her. Miss Ashby. Bert, that's a different ranch you're kneeling on. I know it is. That's ranch that could grow something. I know. She stood up. She wiped her fingers on the leg of her jeans and left a dark streak on the faded blue denim. She looked at the ridge in the last of the sun, and she thought for the first time in 6 months that she might actually get to keep this ground. She did not say that out loud. She said, "Let's get in before your wife starts to worry." Yes, ma'am. That was in the last week of April. By the first week of June, Lorna had rebuilt every failed section of ditch and added spurs at the head of 9 natural creases she had identified after walking the ridge in the mud. She and Bert and Cade had planted another 1,800 pear pads from cuttings taken off the 800 she had bought in Cobble the summer before because pear roots easy and thick, and a woman with almost no money and a lot of time can grow her stock on the ground she already stands on. She had transplanted 41 mesquite seedlings from the community nursery over near Cedral. She had traded 10 laying hens to her neighbor Ida Prentice for 120 used fence posts. She had traded a broken hay elevator to a man in post for a workable one. She had learned to slaughter and butcher a calf herself because Bert's brother-in-law who used to do it was drinking again and could not be trusted with a knife. The days by then had a shape to them. She rose at 5. She fed the mules and the chickens by 5:30. She met Bert at the ridge at 6. They worked until the heat drove them off, usually by 11. She came back to the house, ate whatever her mother had made, wrote in the notebook for 30 minutes, walked out to check the herd, went back to the ridge in the evening cool. She was in bed by 9. She dreamed always of water. Sometimes the water was doing what she wanted it to do. Sometimes it was not. She woke both ways at 4:30. She lay in the dark and listened for the wind for a while, and then she got up. Cade Nabors, who was now 18 and had a face full of judgment about most things, had stopped rolling his eyes when she talked. He had begun, in fact, to walk ahead of her along a slope and mark contour lines with lime before she asked him to. One afternoon, standing at the top of a small swale, he had laid out entirely on his own. He squinted down the line and said mostly to himself, "If we put another one about 10 feet above this one don't blow out on a hard rain." Lorna said, "You just told the ridge what to do." Cade rubbed the back of his neck. "Don't tell my daddy I said it that way. He'll laugh at me." But Bert had stopped laughing at that kind of talk months before. The talk in town, however, had not stopped. It had changed. It had gotten meaner. Because in a small county, when a young woman starts to actually make headway against odds, everyone had already agreed she could not beat the men who had bet against her, have a choice to make. Some of them choose humility, most of them do not. Most of them, when their prediction begins to look bad, do not begin to doubt themselves. They begin to doubt her. They begin to look for the trick. They begin to look for the reason it is not fair. The reason they decided was rain. "She got lucky," said Denton at the co-op meeting on the second Tuesday in June. "Her ridge caught a shower, we didn't, that's all." "It's a freak thing," said another rancher. "You watch," Denton said. "Come July, she'll be back where the rest of us are. That kind of trick don't hold in a real dry year." Merle Tanscott, sitting at the head of the room in his glasses on a chain, wrote something in the meeting minutes and did not say anything. Hollis Rourke did not say anything at the meeting either. Hollis Rourke was a different problem. Hollis Rourke did his talking somewhere else. She learned about Hollis Rourke on a Sunday morning in July. She had driven into Cobble to pick up her mother from the little church at the crossroads, And while she was waiting in the truck, she watched a green pickup pull up outside the diner across the street. Hollis Rourke got out. He was in a clean Sunday shirt. He went inside. 2 minutes later, a tan sedan pulled up behind Hollis's truck, and out of the sedan stepped Delph Yeager. Yeager went into the diner too. Lorna sat in her father's Chevy with the engine off and the window down and watched the door of the diner for 41 minutes. When Yeager came out, he was holding a folded piece of paper. When Hollis came out 2 minutes later, he was tucking a white business envelope into his back pocket, and he was smiling, and it was a private smile. The kind a man smiles when a deal has just gone the way he wanted it to go. Yeager drove north. Hollis drove east in the direction of his own ranch, which shared its western fence line with the Ashby place for 800 yards. Between them along that fence line ran a shallow draw, and in that draw on the Rourke side sat the shared water well that Emmett Ashby and Hollis Rourke's father had drilled together in 1959. The well was on Rourke ground, but the paperwork Emmett had signed with the elder Rourke in '59 had given the Ashby place a permanent easement on it. It was in writing. It was in the county records. It was the reason the Ashby cows had water in dry years. Lorna sat in the truck. She did not go get her mother out of the church. She sat with her hands on the wheel of her father's pickup, and she thought slow and cold. And by the time Odell Ashby came out into the sunlight and shaded her eyes looking for her daughter, Lorna had understood a thing about her ranch she had not understood the day before. The laughter at the feed and seed had not been a random cruelty. Hollis Rourke did not want her to make it. Hollis Rourke was arranging quietly for her not to make it. Because if the Ashby place went to Delph Yeager and Yeager filed on the aquifer, then the shared well in the draw was going to become a fight. And in that fight, Hollis Rourke had already been paid to be on the other side. She helped her mother into the truck. She drove home. She did not speak. Odell Ashby did not ask. That night at the kitchen table, Lorna opened her blue spiral notebook to a fresh page. She wrote a date at the top. She wrote 3 names down the left margin: Rourke, Yeager, Denton. Under each name, she wrote what she knew. Under Rourke, she wrote the diner and the envelope and the shared well. Under Yeager, she wrote the leather book and the hardware store and the sentence about the note coming due. Under Denton, she wrote nothing because Denton was so far only a mouth. But she left space because in her experience, a mouth was usually attached to something else. She closed the notebook. She poured a second cup of coffee. She thought about her father sitting at this same table 30 years ago, writing about wild pear in his own notebook, choosing not to tell any of these same men what he had seen. She thought about her mother's phrase that a ranch does not get built on a mustache, and she understood it in a new way in the summer of '04, in a kitchen that smelled of coffee grounds and cedar smoke. It was not only about staying, it was about seeing. The men were counting on her not to see. She was going to see everything. By the last week of July, the fence between the Ashby place and the Rourke place had been cut 3 separate times. The first time she found it on a Wednesday morning was 10 yards south of the shared well. 2 strands of barbed wire had been snipped clean with pliers. 6 of Hollis Rourke's steers had walked through the gap and into the rested pasture where she had been protecting the new pair rows for 11 months. The steers had trampled 14 mesquite seedlings, ripped open 6 brush corrals, and eaten the growing tips off close to 200 pear pads. She and Kay drove them out at a walk because Rourke's steers were skittish and would have run through another 2 fences if pushed. She fixed the wire that afternoon. The second time it happened 4 days later was 200 yards further south. The cut was cleaner. The damage was worse. The third time on a Tuesday morning at first light, Lorna caught the boy who had done it. I was 15 years old. He was Hollis Rourke's nephew, a slack-faced kid named Wyatt Ames, and he had a pair of fencing pliers in one hand and a look on his face like he had been caught pulling the wings off a fly. He froze when he saw her come up the draw with her father's rifle broken open in the crook of her arm. The rifle was not loaded. The rifle had not been loaded since her father had put it up in 1998. But Wyatt Ames did not know that. She said, "Put the pliers on the ground, Wyatt." He put them on the ground. She said, "Sit down over there, on that stone." He sat down. She said, "Who told you to do this?" Wyatt looked at the ground. He was going to cry. He was 15 and he was going to cry, and Lorna felt sorry for him in a way that did not stop her from doing what she needed to do next. Uncle Hollis said you were fixing to steal our well. He said that. He said Papa was going to lose the fence line if you finished all that ditch work you're doing. He said the county would move the line. That's not what the county does, Wyatt. He said. I know what he said. She squatted down in front of him. She spoke softly. She said, Wyatt, look at me. He looked at her. I am going to take pictures of the cut fence. I am going to take pictures of these pliers. I am going to take a picture of you sitting on that stone. I am not going to show them to the sheriff. Not yet. I am going to show them to Merle Tanscott and to your grandfather, and your grandfather is going to have a talk with your uncle. Do you understand me? He nodded. You are going to go home. You are not going to tell your uncle you were caught. You are going to say the cows got out on their own. You are going to say the fence must have snapped. Do you understand me? He nodded again. If you ever come back on this ground with a pair of pliers, Wyatt Ames, I will not be so gentle. Do you understand me? Yes, ma'am. Go home. I went. She took the pictures with a little cardboard-cased Kodak she had bought at the drugstore in Lubbock the winter before. She took her time. She got the cut wire from 3 angles. She got the pliers on the ground. She got the tracks in the draw. She wound the film and she put the camera in her jacket pocket, and she walked back to the house through the pear rows in the morning heat. And by the time she got to the porch, she had decided what she was going to do. She was not going to the sheriff. She was going to the co-op. Because in Kestrel County in 2004, the co-op was not just a place that held a note. The co-op was where a rancher's reputation lived and died. If she went to the sheriff, Hollis Rourke would deny it, and it would be her word against a 15-year-old's, and the sheriff would shrug. If she went to the co-op and she brought pictures, and she brought a written record of damages with dates and dollar figures, and she asked for a hearing under the grazing agreement that governs shared fence lines, then Hollis Rourke would have to sit in a room with his neighbors, and his neighbors would have to look at him, and every one of them would remember it. She spent 2 days getting the file ready. She wrote out an itemized list of damages. 14 mesquite seedlings at $3 a seedling, 6 brush corrals at 40 minutes of labor each, 211 pear pads with growing tips eaten off, 42 yards of barbed wire, 3 cuts. Time to gather stray steers, 4 hours across 2 people. She priced her own labor at the same rate she paid Bert. She did not inflate a single number. She underpriced 2 of them. She took the film into Cobble on a Friday and had it developed at the drugstore. She paid extra for the 1-day service. She got the pictures back on Saturday morning. She put the pictures in a manila envelope with the itemized list and a 1-page description of the incident dated and signed. She wrote at the top of the description, requesting hearing under Section 4 Co-op Grazing Agreement of 1971 on repeated cutting of shared fence line and damage to protected pasture. She drove to Merle Tanscott's house on Sunday afternoon. Merle came to the door in his shirt sleeves. He looked at her. He looked at the manila envelope in her hand. Come in, Lorna. She came in. She sat at his kitchen table. She slid the envelope across to him. He put on his reading glasses. He opened it. He looked at the pictures without saying anything. He looked at the itemized list. He looked at the description. He closed the envelope. He took off his reading glasses. He said, "You're sure about this?" "I'm sure. You know what you're asking." "I know. Hollis Rourke has been on that co-op board for 11 years. "Yes, sir." "He is going to fight you." "I know." Merle looked at his hands. He said, "Your daddy would not have brought this." "No, sir. Your daddy would have fixed the fence 3 times and gone home." "Yes, sir. And that is why your daddy died with $8,400 owed on a place that could have been paid off." Lorna did not answer. Merle put the envelope in a drawer of the kitchen table. He said, "I'll set the hearing for a week from Tuesday." "Thank you, Merle. Don't thank me yet." The hearing was on a Tuesday night in the co-op meeting hall, which was a rented room above the feed store with folding chairs and a coffee urn and a linoleum floor. 27 ranchers came. That was more than usually came to a regular meeting. Word had traveled. Lorna wore the same red and cream flannel and the same caramel jacket she wore every day. She did not dress up. She did not put on lipstick. She did not put her hair in anything other than the low ponytail she always wore. She sat at a folding chair in the front row with the manila envelope on her lap, and Bert Neighbors sat behind her and Odell Ashby sat beside her. Hollis Rourke came in 10 minutes late. He was wearing a pressed shirt. He did not look at Lorna. He sat down at the co-op table at the front because he was a board member, and that was where he sat, and he crossed his arms. Merle read the complaint out loud. He read the itemized list. He passed the photographs down the row of board members. When the photographs got to Hollis Rourke looked at them for a long moment. He set them down. He said, "None of this proves who cut that fence." Lorna stood up. She said, "Mr. Chairman, if I may." Merle nodded. She said, "I am not here tonight to accuse Hollis Rourke of cutting my fence." The room went quiet in a specific way. She said, "I am here because that fence has been cut 3 times this summer. I do not know for certain who did it. I have a suspicion. My suspicion is not evidence. What I have brought tonight is evidence of damage, evidence of loss, and evidence that the shared fence has been cut in a pattern that suggests intent, not accident." Under Section 4 of the grazing agreement, when a shared fence is cut and cattle from one side damage a protected pasture on the other, the owner of the cattle is responsible for the damage regardless of who did the cutting. I am asking this board to enforce that section. I am asking Hollis Rourke, whose cattle came through the cut fence and did the damage, to pay for the damage. That is all I am asking tonight. She sat down. Hollis Rourke uncrossed his arms. He looked at Merle. He looked at the men at the table on either side of him. He said, "That's a hell of a reading of Section 4. "It is the reading of Section 4, Merle said. There was a silence. Hollis Rourke said, and he said it slow, the way a man says something when he has just realized the room is not with him. "I'll pay for the damage. I don't admit to cutting anything, but I'll pay for the damage." "Thank you, Hollis," Merle said. The hearing was over. She did not gloat. She did not smile. She stood up and shook Merle Tanscott's hand, and she walked out of the co-op meeting hall with her mother on her arm and Bert Neighbors behind her, and she did not say a word until they were in the truck. Then she said, "Bert, would you drive Mama home? I need a minute." Bert took the keys. Lorna stood in the parking lot of the feed store in the dark, and she let herself shake once all the way through. Then she stopped. Then she got in the passenger seat of her own truck and let another man drive her home for the first time in a year and a half. She sat with her forehead against the passenger window and watched the section road roll past in the dark, and she thought about her father, who would not have brought that complaint. Merle had been right about that. Her father would have fixed the fence 3 times and gone home and eaten his supper in silence, and the men who had cut the fence would have known from his silence that he was not going to make them pay, and they would have cut it a 4th time. That was the country she had grown up in. That was the country she had just decided in a room above a feed store not to live in anymore. That was in the first week of August. The letter came on a Thursday in the last week of the same month. It was on cream-colored paper. It was from a law office in Dallas. It was addressed to Miss Lorna Ashby and to Mr. Garrett Ashby and to Mr. Lonnie Ashby, care of the Ashby Homestead, Cauble, Texas. The letter said that a client of the firm, a Mr. Delph Yeager, was prepared to offer the Ashby family a purchase price of $112,000 for a 60-acre portion of the north pasture adjacent to the 2-lane. The offer would clear the co-op note in full, provide each Ashby sibling a distribution of approximately $32,000 after closing costs, and allow the family to retain the remaining 400 acres of the ranch, including the homestead, the barn, and all improvements. The letter said the offer was open for 30 days. The letter said that a Mr. Yeager was available for a meeting at the family's convenience. Lorna read the letter at the kitchen table. Her mother read it after her. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then Odell said, "Call your brothers." Lorna called Garrett first. She read him the letter over the phone. He was quiet for so long she thought the line had gone dead. Then he said, Lorna. I know. Lorna, $32,000. I know. That's a house down payment. That's college for a kid. I know what it is, Garrett. You wouldn't be losing the ranch. You'd be selling 60 acres of the sorriest ground on the place. You'd keep 400. You'd keep the house. You'd pay off the note. Everybody wins. Lorna closed her eyes. She said, Garrett, do you know what Yeager wants with 60 acres of the sorriest ground on the place? He wants to build warehouses. He wants to file water rights. He wants to. He wants the aquifer, Garrett. There was a longer silence. She said, you remember the shared well with the Rourkes? Course I remember. That well pumps out of the Ogallala. So do the wells on the McGinnis place and the coffee place and every little farm hooked along the section road. If Yeager files on volumes, he can pull out of a 60-acre parcel adjacent to the two-lane, and if the state grants him even half of what he files for in 10 years, there is not a shallow well between here and the escarpment that will hit water. Merle told me. He wouldn't say it on the record, but he told me. Garrett said, careful. That's a rumor, Lorna. It is a rumor with a paper trail in Austin, and Yeager has been buying every parcel he can get along that road for 2 years, and he has been paying Hollis Rourke to help him get this one. You know that for a fact. I know Hollis Rourke has been paid something by Delph Yeager. I saw the envelope. That's not. I know what I saw. She heard her brother breathing. He said softer, Lorna. Even if that's all true, what are you and me supposed to do about it? We're two people. Yeager is a firm in Dallas. If we don't sell, somebody else on this road will. He gets there in the end. He doesn't get there through this ranch. You're saying no to $32,000 over a rumor. I'm saying no to selling my neighbor's water for $32,000. There was a very long silence. Garrett said, I'll call Lonnie. Garrett, please, before you call him, hear me. I'm hearing you. I have 12 months until the balloon. I have a plan. I have receipts. I can show you what this ground has done in 1 year, and I can show you what it will do in 3. I am asking you as your sister to give me 12 months. Not to sell, not to sign, just 12 months. And if you can't pay the balloon, then we sell in September of '04. Then Yeager or someone else gets what he wants. Then you get your 32,000, but you get it after I have tried, and you get it knowing your sister tried. Garrett said quiet, that's not fair. I know it's not fair. That's putting it on me. I know. There was a longer silence than any of the ones before. Then Garrett said, 12 months. 12 months. If you miss one payment on that note, Lorna, one payment, I will sign that offer myself. You have my word. He hung up. Lorna sat at the kitchen table with the receiver in her hand and the dial tone humming, and after a while she put it back in the cradle. Her mother was watching her from the stove. He said yes. He said 12 months. And Lonnie, Garrett will handle Lonnie. Odell nodded. She turned back to the stove. She said without turning around, your papa could not have made that phone call, Lorna. I know. That is why we are still on this ground. Lorna did not answer. She stood up. She walked to the window. She looked out at the ridge in the late afternoon sun. The pear rows were long, dark lines across the face of the hill. The mesquite seedlings were the size of a child's arm now. The swales from this distance looked like faint bracelets around the shoulders of the land. It was still ugly ground. It was still poor ground. But it was ground that was beginning to hold on to what fell on it. And in the west, a low bank of clouds was building along the escarpment, the color of pewter, and the light along the underside of the clouds had that green edge that means weather. She said quietly, 12 months. The clouds came in that night. It rained for 2 hours, not hard, steady. In the morning, she walked the ridge with Bert. Every swale held, every spur held, every stone weir held. In the low places, the water stood in bright brown stair-step pools that had not been there 24 hours before, and around each pool, the ground was dark for 4 feet in every direction where the water was reaching sideways into the soil. Two of Cade's new swales cut in June had a fine green fuzz along their downhill lips that Lorna knelt to look at and could not immediately name. Bert squatted beside her. "That's Little Bluestem," he said. "Volunteer. I ain't seen Little Bluestem on this ridge in 15 years." Lorna touched the tips of the seedlings. They were the color of new pennies at the base and green as spring wheat above. "Bert, ma'am, how long since anybody in this county has seen native grass come back on caliche ground without being seeded?" Bert did not answer for a while. Then he said, "I ain't ever seen it. My daddy told me about it once. He said it happened in 1942 on the McGinnis home place after they let a piece rest 4 years. He said it was the prettiest thing he ever saw. He said it looked like the land remembering itself." Lorna sat back on her heels. She looked out at the ridge, at the pear rows and the little swales and the volunteer bluestem and the mesquite seedlings that were no longer seedlings. She said, "It's remembering Bert." "Yes, ma'am. It's remembering." She stood up. She dusted her hands on her jeans. She walked back down toward the house, and behind her, the ridge stood in the morning sun with its shallow green bracelets and its dark pools and its long dark lines of pear and its little breathing squares of rested pasture. And Bert Neighbors stood at the top of the ridge with his hat in his hand and watched her go. And behind him along the far fence line, where the shared well sat in the shallow draw, Hollis Rourke's cattle grazed a pasture that was already starting to yellow at the edges 3 weeks before the calendar said it should. The weather was turning. It was the last good rain that ridge would see for a long time. The balloon came due on September the 15th of '04. Lorna walked into the co-op with a bank draft in her jacket pocket, and Merle Tanscott stamped the note paid to maturity, and the deed was signed over from the joint tenancy of the three siblings into her sole name at the courthouse in Kestrel that afternoon. Garrett and Lonnie signed by mail. She had paid them out slow over the 12 months at friendly family prices, using every calf that would sell and every side of butchered beef her mother would let go, and every pear cutting she could ship to a small grower who was starting up in Sonora. She made it. Barely. She made it with $132 left in her account and a broken water pump on the mule's trough that she and Bert fixed the next morning with baling wire and a rubber gasket cut from an old inner tube. That night she sat at the kitchen table with the paid note in front of her, and she cried once for 6 seconds. Then she stopped. Then she went out to the ridge in the dark, and she stood beside the first swale her father had begun, and she had finished, and she said, "One down to the ridge." And the ridge did not answer, because the ridge does not answer twice in the same year. Delph Yeager filed paperwork in Austin the same month. Hollis Rourke sat on his porch and read the classifieds in the cobble paper. Garrett drove up from Fort Worth for Christmas and stood under the mesquite in the yard and did not know what to say to a sister who had done what he had told her she could not do. He said, "The place looks better." She said, "Thank you." That was all they said about it that Christmas. Some things you leave to grow. The story of '05 and '06 was a different story. It was the story of a slow, quiet, patient buildup of green things and dark soil and full stock tanks and a herd that was creeping back up toward 50 head. It was the story of a woman who was learning her ranch faster than her ranch could surprise her, and of a man in Dallas who was learning that a young rancher in Kestrel County did not scare, and of a neighbor across a fence line who was beginning at night in the dark of his own bedroom to wonder if he had bet on the wrong horse. But the story after that, the story of '07 and '08 and '09, was going to be a harder story again, because the sky over Kestrel County was going to stop giving. And when the sky stops giving in West Texas on the Caprock on ground that 100 years of ranchers have hammered flat, what happens next is not a slow thing. It is a fast thing. It is a killing thing. It comes for the herds first, and the wells second, and the pride of men third. And by the time it is done, a county looks around and counts who is still standing. In the summer of 2009, in the worst drought Kestrel County would see in 40 years, Ashby, 30 years old, cracked hands, and her father's notebook still in the breast pocket of her caramel jacket, was going to be one of the ones still standing. And Hollis Rourke was going to walk to her fence line with his hat in his hand. The winter of 2008 came in dry. That was the first sign. It came in dry the way a bad year always comes in dry without announcing itself, without a headline in the cobble paper, without so much as a word at the co-op meeting in December. Just a January with no snow on the escarpment, and a February with two rains that did not add up to half an inch between them. And by the time March arrived, the ranchers along the two-lane were checking their stock tanks a little more often than usual and telling themselves it was nothing. Lorna Ashby was 29 years old that spring. Her hands had thickened. Her shoulders had squared. The little heart shape of her chin was the same, and the light blue-gray eyes were the same, and the pecan-colored hair still came loose at her temples, the way it had when she was 24. But her face had settled into the face of a woman who had stopped waiting to be taken seriously and had gotten to work. When she walked into a room now, men who had once laughed at her looked down at their coffee cups. She did not enjoy that. She noticed it and moved past it. Enjoyment was a luxury of people who had won things they did not have to defend. She stood on the ridge on a Sunday morning in the second week of March and looked west toward the escarpment, and she saw the color of the sky, and she knew. She did not tell her mother. She did not tell Bert. She went back to the house and she opened the blue spiral notebook to a fresh page, and she wrote the date at the top, and under the date she wrote a single word: drought. Underneath she began to list. Number of head on the ranch: 49. Weight range: estimated forage on hand. Number of pear pads harvestable per month without damaging the rows. Number of gallons per day out of the shared well at current draw. Volume in the two rebuilt stock tanks. Estimated evaporation rate at 95 degrees. Feet of contour swale on the ridge. Number of mesquites over 4 feet tall. Number that were casting real shade. She wrote all of it. She did not know yet what she would do with the list. She just knew that from this morning forward, every decision she made on this ranch was going to depend on numbers, and if the numbers were not written down, she would fool herself into remembering them wrong. She had learned that from her father's notebook. Her father had written down everything, and he had died broke. But the notebook was why she had understood the ridge. The notebook was why she had not sold. The notebook was why the pear rows existed, and why the mesquites cast shade, and why the swales held water, and why the co-op had backed off Hollis Rourke in the summer of '04. The notebook was why her ranch in the second week of March of '09 was already braced for what the sky was doing, and the other ranches were not. She wrote for 2 hours. She closed the notebook. She poured a second cup of coffee. She went out to the barn to check the harnesses on the 2 mules she and Bert had traded a broken tractor for the year before, because if the drought was coming, diesel was going to be too dear to burn on light work and mules eat pear. The last good rain of '09 fell in the third week of April. It was 1/4 of an inch. It sat on the ridge for one afternoon and was gone by the next morning. Every rancher in Kestrel County stood on his porch that evening and watched the storm cells break up over the escarpment and drift south without them. And every one of them said the same 3 words to himself in the dark of his own kitchen: please, one more. There was not one more. By the 1st of June, the pastures along the section road had gone the color of straw. By the 15th of June, the natural playas were cracked open. By the 4th of July, there was a stock tank on the McGinnis place that had been full at Easter and that a boy could now walk across without wetting his boots. On the coffee place at the far end of the section road, an old rancher named Junior Coffee, who had held on through the drought of the '50s, came out to feed one morning and found 4 heifers dead in a fence corner where they had crowded together for shade that was no longer there because the last elm along that fence had died in September of '07 and nobody had planted anything else. Junior Coffee sat down on the running board of his truck and looked at those 4 heifers and cried in a way an 81-year-old man is not supposed to have any tears left to cry. And by the middle of the same week, he had made 2 phone calls. And by the end of the month, his herd was on a truck to a sale barn in Amarillo, where it went for 42 cents on the dollar of what it had been worth at Easter. That was how it started on the coffee place. That was how it started up and down the 2-lane It started one heifer at a time. It started with the smallest thing you could not fix, which was shade. Because a man who plants shade in the last 5 years of his working life is planting for his grandchildren, and most men are not that patient, and the ones who are do not brag about it. The county had not been patient. The county had cut its brush and burned its mesquite and pulled its cactus and hammered its ground flat for 100 years. And by the summer of '09, there was not a mile of the two-lane in Kestrel County where you could stand at noon and find shade wide enough for 4 cows, except on the Ashby place. At the co-op meeting on the second Tuesday in July, 29 ranchers came in out of the heat and sat under a ceiling fan that was doing nothing to the air. And Merle Tanscott called the meeting to order and looked out at the room and did not say what he was thinking. He did not say half of you are going to be gone by Christmas. He did not say the ones of you who bet everything on rented pasture and bought hay are going to be selling calves at 40 cents on the dollar within 8 weeks. He looked out at the room and he cleared his throat and he said, "Boys, we got a hard one coming." Hollis Rourke sat at the board table. He did not look at Lorna. Lorna sat in the third row with Bert Neighbors on her right and an empty chair on her left. She had come to listen, not to speak. Denton, sitting 3 rows behind her, said, "How bad is bad, Merle? Bad as 56. There was a small movement in the room. 56 was a word. 56 was the drought that had emptied out 3 counties. 56 was the reason there were section road addresses in Kestrel County where the houses were still standing, but nobody had lived in them since Eisenhower. 56 was the drought that Junior Coffey had lived through as a boy, watching his father shoot the last 2 milk cows himself because he could not stand to see them starve. And Junior Coffey had told that story to 2 people in his life. One of them, his son, who had moved away to Odessa in the '90s, and the other one, Emmett Ashby, in 1992, over a cup of coffee at the Cobble Diner. And Emmett had listened to it with his eyes down and had gone home that night and written down in the green notebook, "JC lost his milk in '56. His daddy did it with a rifle. Do not let it get that far." Denton said, "Since when?" "Since 2 weeks ago, but I ain't been telling nobody because I wanted to see if it'd break. It ain't going to break." Hollis Rourke said, "Merle, what's your read on the pair?" The whole room turned an inch, because Hollis Rourke was not a man who asked about pear at a co-op meeting. Hollis Rourke was a man who had leaned on the porch rail of the Feed and Seed 6 years ago and made the loudest joke in the county about a woman planting pear. Merle Tanscott looked at Hollis. He looked at Lorna. He said, "Careful, pear will get some folks through if they have it. Nobody has enough of it planted to matter. Except." He did not finish the sentence. He did not have to. Hollis Rourke looked down at his hands. Lorna did not move. She kept her face still. Bert Neighbors beside her took a very slow breath in through his nose and let it out even slower. Denton, still behind her, said loud enough for everyone to hear, "The Ashby place, that's what he means. The Ashby place has pear." Someone else said, "That freak stunt of hers." Denton said, "It ain't a stunt no more." There was a silence in the room that was longer than the ones that had come before. Merle Tanscott moved on to the next item on the agenda. But something had shifted. Something had cracked in the room the way ground cracks after a long dry. It was not admiration yet. It was not apology. It was the sound of a county starting finally to look at Lorna Ashby with a different set of eyes. She did not smile. She went home. She wrote in the notebook, "Coop meeting." Merle called it 56. Hollis asked about the pair. Denton named the ranch out loud. Nobody laughed. Something has changed. She underlined the last line. Then she went out to the ridge and stood in the evening heat and looked at the pear rows and the mesquites and the swales, and she thought, "All right, ranch, now you show them." The pear was ready. She had been preparing for this since 2007, when she had first read the long-range climate signals in the almanacs and the state extension pamphlets, and had decided that whatever the sky did, she was going to have 2 years of forage banked on the hoof. She had thickened the pear rows. She had rotated harvests. She had trained Cade Neighbors, who was 23 now, and running his own crew to singe the pads with a torch, to remove the glochids and the larger spines to score them with a knife so the moisture would come out of the skin during a slow air cure, to mix the cured pads with rolled Milo and cottonseed meal and a small measured dose of mineral salt so the cows would not scour on the sugar. She had built a curing rack under the shade of the biggest mesquites on the ridge, and it held 400 pounds of pear pads at a time. She had a second rack behind the barn. She had a third rack behind the far pear row. She had a system. It was not fancy. It was not something she had read in a book. It was something she had built out of watching her cows eat and watching her cows not eat and watching her cows bloat in one small bad experiment in the fall of '05 that she had learned from without losing an animal, thank God, and every notebook page she kept was another line in a manual nobody in the county had thought to write down. On a Monday morning in the third week of July, Hollis Rourke drove his green pickup up the section road at a walk and stopped at the Ashby gate. He did not blow the horn. He got out. He took off his straw hat. He walked to the fence. Lorna was in the near pasture with Cade Neighbors and Bert. They were cutting pear. They saw the truck. They saw Hollis Rourke standing at the gate with his hat in his hand, and Cade Neighbors, who had spent his teenage years listening to Hollis Rourke make jokes at Lorna's expense in the town cafe, stopped cutting and stood up straight and stared. Lorna said, "Cade, ma'am, keep cutting, ma'am." She walked to the gate alone. The gate was a length of barbed wire and a stick. She did not open it. She stood on her side of the wire and Hollis Rourke stood on his, and she looked at him and did not speak first because that was how her father would have done it, and that was how she was going to do it too. Hollis Rourke was a bigger man than she was. He had 30 pounds on her and 30 years. He was 58 and his mustache had gone the color of galvanized wire. He held his hat against his chest with both hands. His hands up close were not the hands of a rich man. They were the hands of a rancher who had worked 800 acres for 34 years and had watched his cattle start to bunch in the shade of nothing this summer. And Lorna Ashby on her side of the fence understood in that moment that the man in front of her had already been humiliated by the sky before he ever walked up the section road to be humiliated by her. He said, "Miss Ashby, Mr. Rourke, how many head is your pair feeding?" 49, steady. For how much longer? At current draw, through February. February? Yes, sir. He nodded. He looked down at his hat. He said, "I got 68 heads still standing. Off the truck, I sold 30. They went at 41 cents. I can't afford to sell the rest of the 68 at 41 cents, and I can't afford to feed them what hay is going for in post." "No, sir, you can't. Would you sell me pear?" She let the question sit in the air between them for a moment. She said, "Mr. Rourke, yes. I have wanted to hear you ask me that question for 6 years." He did not answer. He did not raise his eyes. He just held his hat. She said, "But I am not going to sell you pear." The muscle in his jaw moved. He said, "Quiet, Miss Ashby. I am not going to sell it to you," she said, "because if I sell it to you, you will feed it to your cows the way you feed your cows everything else, which is to say you will pitch it into a bunk and expect them to eat it, and they will bloat, and half of them will scour, and you will lose them anyway, and then you will say the pear did not work. And every rancher on this road who is watching this summer will hear you say it, and they will believe you." Hollis Rourke looked up. She said, "I will teach you how to prepare it. I will send Cade Neighbors to your barn for 3 afternoons. He will show you how to cure the pads and how to score them and what to mix them with. When he is satisfied that you know how to do it right, I will sell you pear at cost. Not a penny more, not a penny less. And I will sell you the same pear I would eat myself before I let a cow of mine bloat on it. Do you understand me?" She had not raised her voice. She had not stepped closer to the wire. She had spoken the way her mother had spoken to her under the mesquite, the winter her father died, which was the way a woman speaks when she has already forgiven a man for what he did, but does not intend to let him forget it. Hollis Rourke put his hat on his head. He said, "Yes, ma'am. Cade will be at your place tomorrow at 6. Yes, ma'am. Mr. Rourke, Ma'am, there is one more thing. Yes, ma'am. I know about the envelope. Hollis Rourke went still. It was a stillness like a rabbit's, complete and quiet. He looked at her. He did not ask which envelope. She said, I saw you take it from Delph Yeager outside the diner in July of '04. I have known about it for 5 years. I have never told anyone. Not the co-op, not Merle, not my brothers, not the sheriff, nobody. And I am not going to tell anyone now. He said hoarse, Miss Ashby. But you are going to tell me what was in it. He looked at the ground between them for a long time. She waited. In the pair rows behind her, Cade neighbors had gone back to cutting. The sound of the machete on the pads was the only sound. Somewhere further off, a mockingbird ran through half of its repertoire and stopped. He said it was $2,000 in cash. For what? For the well. For what about the well? For a paper I signed that said, if the Ashby place ever come up for auction, I would put in a claim against the easement. On the shared well, that the easement had lapsed, that my daddy's signature on the '59 paperwork was under duress. It was a lie. Everything I signed was a lie. But he paid me $2,000 cash, and I took it, and I banked it. You still got that paper? He has it. Yeager has it. He said he'd only use it if you defaulted. He said as long as you was making payments, the paper sat in his drawer. When you made the balloon in '04, he called me and said the paper wasn't operative anymore. But he never give it back. He never gives anything back. No, ma'am. Lorna nodded slow. She said, Mr. Rourke, I want you to write down in your own hand what you just told me. I want a date on it. I want your signature on it. And I want it in an envelope in my hands by Friday morning. If you do that, no one else will ever see it as long as I am living. If you do not do that, I go to Merle Tanscott on Monday with everything I have watched and everything I have written down since 2003. Do you understand me? Yes, ma'am. Cade will be at your barn at 6 tomorrow. Yes, ma'am. Good day, Mr. Rourke. Good day, Miss Ashby. He turned, he walked back to his truck. He got in. He did not close the door for a full minute. Then he closed the door and he drove back down the section road slower than he had come up it, and he did not blow his horn and he did not look back. Lorna stood at the wire for another minute. Then she turned and walked back to the pair rows. Cade neighbors looked up at her. He said, ma'am, Cade, I am going to his barn tomorrow at 6. You are. I would like to know how much of what I just watched I can tell my daddy tonight. You can tell your daddy all of it, Cade. You can also tell him that Mr. Rourke and I have come to an understanding and that we are not going to be talking about the past any more than we have to. Yes, ma'am. She picked up her machete and she went back to work. Bert Neighbors behind her did not say anything. He did not have to. The envelope came on Friday morning. Cade Neighbors brought it. It was a plain white envelope with Lorna's name written on it in a careful, blocky, embarrassed hand. Inside was one sheet of paper. On the sheet of paper in the same careful hand was written a 217-word confession dated and signed by Hollis Rourke. Lorna read it. She put it in the tin biscuit box under her bed in the same box where her father's green notebook lived. She closed the lid. She slid the box back under the box spring. She did not read the paper again for a year. Cade went to Hollis Rourke's barn for 3 afternoons. He taught Hollis how to singe the pads and how to score them and what to mix them with. On the 3rd afternoon, Hollis's wife, a small, quiet woman named Verna, whom Lorna had known since childhood without ever really talking to, came out to the barn with a mason jar of iced tea and set it on the workbench and said to Cade, "You have supper with us tonight, son. I made too much brisket." Cade said, "Yes, ma'am, thank you," and stayed. He came back to the Ashby place at 9 in the evening in his father's truck and told Lorna on the porch in the dark that Hollis Rourke had listened to him for 3 afternoons in a row without interrupting once and had asked him to write it all down on a piece of butcher paper so he could tack it up in the barn, and had at the end of the 3rd day put his hand on Cade's shoulder for a second before he walked out without saying anything. Lorna nodded. She did not say anything either. The pair went to the Rourke place at cost in 3 loads over the next 2 months. Hollis Rourke fed it right. He did not lose a cow. He did not lose a calf. And when a rancher named Alton Meeks came by the Rourke barn in the last week of August and asked to see how the pair feeding worked because he was down to 4 days of hay and looking at selling half his herd, Hollis Rourke took him through it step by step using Cade's butcher paper diagram, and he sent him to the Ashby gate with a note that said in Hollis's careful, blocky hand, "This one's ready. He'll do right by the pair. H.R." Lorna sold Alton Meek's pair at cost. By the end of OH9, she had sold pair to 11 ranchers along the two-lane. Every one of them had come through Cade's 3-afternoon training first. Every one of them had done right by the pair. Not a single cow bloated. Not a single cow scoured worse than the drought was already making them scour. The pair worked. And by the middle of September, the phrase, "You're going to have to talk to Miss Ashby," had become a thing that men said to each other at the feed and seed and cobble without irony and without laughing. The vet came in the second week of August. His name was Doc Whitfield. He was 63 years old. He had been the large animal vet in Kestrel County since before Lorna was born. He had come out to the Ashby place because Lorna had called him about a heifer with a swollen jaw. And by the time he had lanced the abscess and injected the heifer, he had walked with Lorna up to the ridge, because a country vet in a drought is also a set of eyes on a herd. He stood at the top of the ridge and he did not speak for a long time. He said, "Miss Ashby, Doc, how long has it been since you bought hay off the truck?" 14 months. How long has it been since anybody within 20 miles of this ridge has gone 14 months without buying hay off the truck? "I don't know, Doc. I know ain't happened. Not since 42. She did not answer. He said, "Your cows are running at a body condition score of 5.5. In this drought, in this county, I have seen herds down to 3s on rented pasture and hay off the truck. I've seen herds at 2s. I saw a herd at a 2.5 on Wednesday that is going to the sale barn in Amarillo on Friday. Your cows are at 5.5. Your calves are at 6. Yes, sir. I would like to write it up." Write up. "Your operation. I would like to write it up for the state extension office. Not as a puff piece, as a technical brief. The pair rows, the swales, the shade banking, the soil work, the whole plan. I have been in county practice for 38 years. Miss Ashby and I have never seen a small ranch on the Caprock come through a summer like this one, with its cows this heavy. If we don't write down what you did and how you did it 10 years from now, every one of these ranches is going to be doing this and thinking they invented it. I would like the record to say who invented it." She did not answer for a moment. She said, "Doc, I didn't invent it, ma'am. My father wrote a note in a notebook in 1982. I read the note in 2003. Everything I did came out of the note. I was a woman with a shovel who read her dead father's handwriting. That is not inventing." Doc Whitfield looked at her over his glasses. He said, "Miss Ashby, every real invention in the history of the world came out of somebody reading somebody's dead father's handwriting. Let me write it up." She said, "Yes, sir, write it up." He wrote it up. It ran to 11 pages. It was a technical brief. It named the pair cultivars in the seedling species, in the swale angles, in the stocking rates, in the daily feed ratios, in the well draw, in the estimated dollar cost per head of maintaining forage through a 56-grade drought using contour water retention and prickly pear banking on caprock soils. It included 2 hand-drawn diagrams of the ridge. It named the ranch. It named the rancher. It was published as an extension circular in October of '09, and by the middle of November, Lorna Ashby had received 17 letters from ranchers in 6 counties asking for pear cuttings. She sold cuttings at cost. She did not raise the price. The other thing that happened in October of '09 was that Delph Yeager withdrew his water rights applications in Austin. He did not withdraw them because of anything Lorna had done directly. He withdrew them because the drought of '09 had proved to his backers that the Ogallala under Kestrel County was more variable than his consultants had promised, and because 2 of the parcels along the 2-lane he had already purchased had turned out to sit above a fault in the aquifer that ran the water differently than the state map showed. and because a lawyer for a landowners coalition in the next county over had begun to ask questions about the pattern of his purchases that his backers preferred not to have asked. His firm sold the parcels. The section road exhaled. Nobody put it in the paper. Merle Tanscott mentioned it once in passing at the co-op meeting in November, as if he were reading a weather report. Lorna heard it. She did not react. She wrote it in the notebook that night. Yeager withdrew. Section road is safe, for now. She underlined the last two words. The last thing that happened in '09 happened on a Sunday afternoon in the second week of December. It was the anniversary of her father's last week alive. Though she had not marked that on any calendar, she had spent the morning at the house. She had helped her mother wrap a small package for Newt Prentice, who was coming for supper. She had gone out to the barn at 2 in the afternoon to feed the mules and check the curing rack. And on her way back across the yard, she had stopped without knowing why, at the base of the big mesquite where her family had sat the day of her father's funeral. She stood there a long time. The wind was cold. It came out of the north the way it comes off the escarpment in December, dry and clean, and a little bit mean. She put her hand on the trunk of the mesquite. Her hand was rough now. The bark was rougher. She stood there with her hand on the tree that her great-grandfather had planted, and she thought about the tin biscuit box under her bed, and about the note in her father's handwriting from the summer of '82, and about the swale that had blown out on the ridge in April of '04 and taught her where the water actually ran, and about Hollis Rourke's hat held against his chest at her gate, and about Doc Whitfield's diagrams, and about Yeager's applications withdrawn in Austin, and about her brother Garrett, who was going to drive up from Fort Worth on Christmas Eve and stand in the same yard, and she suspected not know how to look her in the eye. She thought about all of it, and then she thought about the first ditch. She had never gone back and put it in words to herself, but she had known since the fall of '03 that the very first swale she had cut with Bert and Cade, the one on the east face of the worst ridge on the ranch, the one that had blown out and taught her to read water, had been cut without her realizing it exactly on top of a broken berm her father had begun and abandoned some year in the '80s. The stones on the low side of her first swale were her father's stones. The angle of her first swale was her father's angle. She had not laid the pattern. She had walked out on the ridge with a line level and a length of tubing, and she had let the land tell her where to dig, and where the land had told her to dig was where her father had already dug. And she had not known it, and he had known she would not know it, and he had left the notebook under the bed anyway. She stood at the base of the mesquite in the cold December wind, and she understood finally at 30 years old that she had not built a ranch. She had finished her father's ranch. She had picked up a shovel her father had put down, and she had walked out on ground. Her father had walked before her, and she had done in 6 years the work he had lost his nerve to finish in the years before he died. And she had done it because he had left her a book that told her how, and because her mother had given her a sentence that had held her up when nothing else could, and because a wiry man named Bert Neighbors had shown up in the rain of '04 to help her rebuild a blown-out ditch, and because a 17-year-old boy named Cade Neighbors had eventually stopped laughing and started marking contour lines, and because Doc Whitfield had gotten out of a truck at a fence and asked to write down what he had seen, and because Delph Yeager had been wrong about the water, and because Hollis Rourke in the end was a rancher and not a monster, and had taken off his hat when it was time to take off his hat. She had finished her father's ranch. She said it out loud to the mesquite in the cold wind in a voice barely above a whisper. "I finished it, Papa." The wind moved the top branches half an inch. She stood there another minute. Then she walked back to the house because supper was at 6 and Newt Prentice would be there at 5:30, and she still had to help her mother with the pie. The note had been paid in full since September of 2004. But the last of the buyout to her brothers, the small friendly installment Garrett had signed for the deed transfer, was paid off in September of 2010. Merle Tanscott handed her the marked paid document across his desk. He did not say anything. He shook her hand across the desk. He held on to it a moment longer than a handshake usually lasts. Then he let go. She drove home. She did not throw a party. She bought a bag of pan dolce and a pound of good coffee and she invited Bert and Cade neighbors and Newt Prentice and Odell and a few of the neighbors who had helped without ever laughing, and they sat on the porch of the farmhouse in the last of the October sun. Odell put the marked paid document on the kitchen table between her father's green notebook and Lorna's blue one, and she looked at the three of them together and she said, "Your papa left questions, Lorna. You cut swales for them." Everybody laughed. But Lorna's eyes filled once and she pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth the way she had learned to do at 24, and she let it pass. She sat on the porch that evening and she watched the light go out of the west, and she listened to Bert Neighbors tell a story about a mule that Cade had once tried to ride bareback when he was 12, and she listened to her mother laugh at the story, and she thought that this was what a good day was supposed to look like at the end of a life like her father's, and he had never had one. He had died in January. He had died in a small bedroom off the kitchen with the window facing east toward a ridge that was still in his last week alive, mostly caliche and broken berm and wild pear chewed to nubs. He had not lived to see this porch. He had not lived to see this coffee. He had not lived to see this laughter. But he had left the notebook, and the notebook had been enough, and Lorna, 30 years old, in the last of the October sun, understood for the first time that some men leave a ranch and some men leave a book, and the book in the long run can be the thing that builds the ranch. Garrett came up 2 weeks later. He did not bring a buyer. He did not bring an offer. He came alone in the black Dodge, still wearing a shirt from work. He walked with his sister up to the ridge. He walked in city shoes. He was uncomfortable on the stones. The mesquites were taller than a man now. The pear rows ran along the face of the ridge in dark green ropes. The swales had softened. Native bluestem was growing along the low lips. A cow lay in the shade of a mesquite in the middle of the afternoon chewing. Garrett stopped at the head of the first swale. He said this was the Caliche Ridge. Yes, this was the ridge Papa never made anything of. Yes. He was quiet a long time. He said, "How much is this ground worth now?" She looked at him. She said, "That is a Fort Worth question, Garrett." "I know it is. I don't have a Fort Worth answer." "I know you don't." He crouched down. He put his hand on the ground under one of the mesquites. He picked up a handful of dirt. It was dark. It had structure. It had fine roots in it. Small living things moved in it. He held it in his hand for a long moment, and then he opened his fingers and let it fall. He said, "I owe you an apology." "You do not owe me an apology. I told you to sell. You were doing the math you knew how to do. I told you to sell in the yard the day we buried him, under that mesquite. I told you Papa broke his back here and never got out." "I remember." "He didn't fail Lorna." "No. He just ran out of time." She looked at her brother. She had not seen him cry since he was 9 years old. He was not crying now, but his face had gone the color it had gone when he was 9, which was the color of a boy who has just understood something that a grown man cannot unlearn. She said, "Garrett, yeah, he would have wanted you to see this." "I know. That's enough." He nodded. He stood up. He wiped his hand on the leg of his slacks. He looked once more at the ridge, and then he walked back down the 2-track to the house, and Lorna walked behind him, and she did not say anything else because there was nothing else that needed to be said. That night he sat at the kitchen table with his mother and his sister, and he ate the meatloaf Odell had made, and he told 2 stories about the Parts house in Fort Worth that were meant to make his mother laugh and did. And when he stood up to leave, he stood at the door for a long moment with his hand on the frame, and then he came back and hugged his sister the way a man hugs a sister when he does not know what else to do with his hands, and he went out into the yard and got in the Dodge and drove back toward Fort Worth in the dark. Odell stood at the sink with her hands in the dishwater and did not turn around. She said, "He came back." "Yes, that's the first time." "I know. Your papa would have been glad." "I know." The community meeting was in November. Merle Tanscott had asked her to speak at the co-op. She had said no 3 times. On the 4th time she had said yes because Merle had said, quiet, "Lorna, there are boys in this county who are going to inherit ranches in the next 10 years. Most of them are going to inherit the same debts and the same dry ground their daddies inherited. If you don't stand up in a room and tell them how you did what you did, they are going to walk into the same trap. I have watched that trap take 3 generations. Please. She had said yes. She stood in front of the co-op meeting hall on a Tuesday night in November of 2010. 38 people came. That was more than usually came. Every folding chair was full. Men stood at the back. Odell Ashby sat in the front row. Bert and Cade Neighbors sat behind her. Newt Prentice sat next to Odell. Doc Whitfield sat 2 rows back. Hollis Rourke sat at the back alone with his hat on his knee. Delph Yeager did not sit anywhere because Delph Yeager had moved on to a county in New Mexico that had not read his file yet. Lorna wore the red and cream flannel and the caramel jacket. She had thought about wearing something else. She had chosen not to. She stood at the front of the room with her father's green notebook in one hand and her blue one in the other, and she looked out at the room, and she did not speak for a moment because a woman is allowed to take a moment before she says something she has been saving for a long time. She said, "I am going to talk to you tonight the way I would talk to you if you were my brother." The room went quiet. She said, "Prickly pear is not magic. If you feed it to a cow wrong, she will bloat. If you plant it in the wrong place and don't cage it, the deer and the goats will eat it before it takes. If you cut a swale on a ridge without walking the ridge in the rain, first the swale will blow out and you will look like a fool and you will feel like a fool and half the county will drive past your fence line and say, 'I told you so.' I know this because it happened to me on this ranch in April of '04. She let that sit. She said, 'None of what I did is magic. None of it is genius. Every single thing I did on that ranch came out of watching what my father wrote down in a notebook in the summer of 1982, and out of watching what my ranch did in the rain, and out of writing down what I saw, and out of doing the same small stubborn thing over and over again for 6 years. That is all. That is the whole thing.'" She paused. She said, "The men who laughed at me in '03 were not stupid men. They were tired men. They had watched their daddies work the same ground the same way for 50 years and end up with nothing. They had learned a set of habits that made sense in a wetter century. They were not wrong to be skeptical of a 24-year-old girl with a truckload of pear pads. They were only wrong about one thing. They were wrong to believe that because their way had not worked, no other way could work. That is the trap. Do not walk into that trap. If you have inherited a piece of ground that never paid for itself, do not assume the ground is worthless. Assume first that the ground has been asked the wrong question. Then start listening to what it says back. She raised the green notebook. She said, "This was my father's. He wrote in it for 31 years. He was not a rich man. He was not a fashionable man. He was not a man anybody in this room ever asked to speak at a co-op meeting. He was a man who wrote things down and who left the notebook under his bed and who trusted that somebody who loved him would read it." She raised the blue notebook. She said, "This is mine. I have written in it every day since March of 2003. If any of you would like to see it, you can. I have nothing in it that is a secret. Everything I know is on the ridge already. You can walk it. Bert Neighbors will walk it with you. Cade Neighbors will walk it with you. Anybody in this room who wants to see how a swale is cut, or how pear is cured, or how a mesquite is caged from a goat is welcome on that ridge in the daylight." She lowered the notebooks. She said, "That is what I have. It is not a lot, but it is enough for one ranch. And if it is enough for one, it is enough for another. That is all I came here to say." She sat down. The room was quiet. Then Doc Whitfield stood up. He clapped once slow. Then Bert Neighbors stood up. Then Cade. Then Newt. Then Odell. Then Merle at the co-op table. Then at the back, Hollis Rourke stood up. He held his hat in his hand. He clapped slow 3 times and then he sat back down. The rest of the room stood. The rest of the room clapped. It was the loudest sound Lorna Ashby had ever heard, and it was not the sound she had come for. She had not come to be applauded. She had come to leave a record so that some boy or girl in the 3rd row would not have to spend 6 years figuring out something that could be written down in one night. But she took the applause. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, and she took the applause, and she thought about her father under the mesquite, and about her mother's phrase, and about her first blown-out swale, and about the tin biscuit box under her bed. And she took the applause on behalf of all of it. It ended. She walked home with her mother on her arm. They walked slowly. Odell was 71, and her hips did not love the cold, and Lorna walked slow with her the way she had walked slow with her father in the last spring of his life, matching the pace of a body that could no longer hurry, and thinking without wanting to, that this too was a thing you inherited, the pace of another person's tired body, the pace of the last walk before a longer stopping. Odell did not say anything most of the way home. When they came up the porch steps, she said, "Your papa would have been proud tonight." And Lorna said, "I know, Mama," and they went inside. Late in the following summer, on a July afternoon, after a short, quick rain of the kind that comes in West Texas after a bad year has finally broken, Lorna walked up to the ridge alone. She was 31 years old. She wore the same flannel and the same jacket, though both had been mended in the elbows. Her hair was still loose at the temples. Her boots were older than the trees. She walked to the head of the first swale, the one that had blown out, the one her father had begun. She squatted down. She hooked 2 fingers into the ground. She lifted a small handful of soil. It came up dark, and it came up loose, and there were fine white root hairs threaded all through it, and a small pale beetle moved out of her palm and dropped back into the ditch. The soil smelled the way garden soil smells. It smelled like something that had been dead and had come back. Above her, in the low branches of a mesquite that had been a stunted cup-sized seedling in the summer of '03, a mockingbird sang. A cow moved slow along the swale line behind her chewing. The wind for once was still. She let the soil fall back into the ditch. She said out loud so that only the ridge could hear her, "She taught the water to get tired." She said it because that was what Cade Neighbors had told a boy in Cobble the week before when the boy had asked him how the Ashby place had done what it had done, and Cade had answered without thinking, and the sentence had come back to Lorna through her mother the same night, and she had written it in the blue notebook that evening, and now she was standing on the ridge saying it back to the ground that had first said it to her 6 summers earlier in the shape of a blown-out ditch. She stood up. She walked back down the ridge in the late afternoon light. Behind her, the swales lay in their soft green bracelets across the face of the land. Below her, the farmhouse sat in the middle of a small, hard-won kingdom. Beyond the farmhouse, along the section road in the pastures of neighbors who had once laughed and who no longer laughed, small dark rows of pear were coming up in the hands of men who had finally, after everything, learned how to ask a piece of ground what it wanted. It was not a miracle. It was just patience. It was just a young woman who had read her father's handwriting. It was just a ranch that had been asked for the first time in 100 years the right question. And the ranch, in its own slow language of held water and dark soil, and volunteer bluestem and mesquite shade, had answered. She went inside. Her mother was at the stove. The kitchen smelled of coffee and cornbread. The blue notebook was on the table beside the green one, and beside both notebooks, in a small unopened envelope with a return address in Sonora, was a letter from a young woman named Ada Bright, who had inherited 140 acres of drought-broken ground from her grandfather, and who had read Doc Whitfield's extension circular, and who wanted to know if it was not too much trouble whether she could drive up to Kestrel County for a day and walk the ridge and be shown in person how to begin. Lorna picked up the letter. She read it twice. She looked at her mother. Her mother said without turning around, "Well," Lorna said, "I'll write her back tonight." She sat down at the table. She opened the blue notebook. She turned to a fresh page. She wrote the date at the top. She wrote a name under the date, Ada Bright. She wrote under the name, Sonora 140 acres grandfather's ground wants to begin. She looked at what she had written for a moment. Then she picked up the pencil again, and under all of it, she wrote the last thing her father had written in the green notebook in July of 1982. The sentence that had become the beginning of everything for her, And would now, she hoped, become the beginning of everything for someone else? Maybe the brush don't get in the way near as much as they say. She closed the notebook. She got up to help her mother with supper. Outside, the ridge stood in the last of the light, and the wind came off the escarpment for a moment and moved the top branches of the old mesquite in the yard, and moved on and was gone, and the ranch and the woman and the ground, and the long, slow, patient answer of the land, settled in for another night in Kestrel County, Texas, in the summer of 2011, at the quiet end of a story that had begun 6 years earlier, with the sound of 6 men laughing on the porch rail of the cobble feed and seed.